Hey, hey, hey! I'm Kate from Kate Talkin' Artistry, the owner and artist behind our watercolor stationery goods and nifty gifties. In today's tutorial, we're going to be talking about one of the watercolor basics. This one is called the glaze. So the glaze is basically when you have one layer of watercolor and you let it dry, and then you add a second layer of watercolor over it. And since watercolor is transparent, the mixing of the layers, of the dry layers, leaves a really lovely effect. This is probably one of the most common techniques that I like to use in my painting. For today's lesson, you're going to need a large wash brush. Here I'm using a Princeton Select oval wash brush, and it's 3/4 of an inch. This just helps get a lot of paint on the page quickly. And you're also going to need watercolor paper. So when you're doing a glaze, you're going to be putting a lot of water on the page, so you're going to want to make sure that you either use tape to tape down your edges or use a watercolor block so your paper doesn't warp. Think about if you dropped your book in the pool or something. You're also going to need watercolor paint. I use Winsor & Newton professional grade watercolor paint tubes, but any watercolor paint tube should work. You're also going to need a cup of water, some paper towels, and a pencil handy if you want. All right, here's my workspace. I'm right-handed, so I keep all of my supplies on my right side so I can reach them easily. Let's make some art. When you're doing watercolor, you can mix paint in a couple different ways. You can mix colors by mixing the paints together and then using it wet, or you can do it by adding layers of paint. To illustrate that, we're going to make a Venn diagram with 3 overlapping circles. I'm just going to take my water cup because it doesn't have to be pretty, and just draw a circle here. You can even freehand it too if you're feeling brave. 1, 2. You can maybe make it overlap a little bit more than I am, just for reference, and then we have 3. So it's no Picasso here, but that's okay. It's just to see the color. So my beautiful Venn diagram. First, we're going to paint one circle yellow. Okay. So let's use my transparent yellow here. I'm going to paint this top circle yellow. And if you go outside the lines, no biggie, no need to sweat. We're just playing around with color, so you're A-okay. All right. Might actually pick up a little bit of that. Now we're going to wait for that to dry. If you are impatient, you can always use a hairdryer, but maybe this is a good moment to just take some deep breaths. Find some peace in your day. Okay. Now that that's dried, we can add on our second layer. Remember, a really great way to check to see if your paint is dry is you can hover your finger over it, not even touching it. Just hover it, and if it feels cool, like if you feel a cool kind of coolness against your finger, then you know it is not dry yet. So you'll have to wait. Obviously, if you use the hairbrush or the hairdryer, that rule doesn't necessarily apply. Okay, so next we're going to animate our red paint and get it nice and juicy here so you have plenty to apply, and we're going to fill in our next circle. All right. So we're using our primary colors today because, as we learned in elementary school, these can make almost all of the colors. Alrighty. Filling this baby in here. And once that's filled in, then you're going to wait for this color to dry. So again, get that hairdryer out or nice deep breaths. And you are ready to go. So now we're going to add our last color. Animate your blue. Make sure it's nice and juicy so you've got a lot of water to play with, a lot of paint to play with, and we're going to fill in our last circle. And notice how the color is starting to layer. You can still see the colors underneath. This is different from acrylic paint where you might not be able to see the colors underneath. This is something that's really unique to watercolor. And you can see how the colors are mixing. So instead of mixing it on our palette before we put it on the page, we're mixing it here. And I kind of like, oh, really good job staying on the line there. I kind of like how it looks different than if you were to mix them together. You see that it's two layers. It looks a little bit, you see the elements of the two paints. So here you've got a hint of purple, you've got a nice hint of green, and then that's the color in between. We've got orange. So there we are. All right, I'm gonna rinse my brush off. And we're gonna wait for that to dry. This is a really good exercise to use to see how your paints play together. If you have a lot of colors, you might want to do something a little bit more robust like this. This, I have taken some of my favorite colors that I'm using on a palette right now, and I've made, it almost looks like a basket weaving, but I've made columns and rows, and then you can see how Opera Rose mixes with cadmium orange, oxide of chromium, Viridian, Mars Black, any of the colors that are on that palette. So you can see, like, when transparent yellow gets a second layer, it gets a lot darker. And when transparent yellow mixes with Viridian, you get this really nice kind of yellowy turquoise, which is fun. So this gives you an idea of what your paint colors are going to look like if you use the glaze technique. So I highly recommend doing this if you have a lot of colors and are still getting used to your paints. This is a great way to acclimate and get to know your paints because they're going to be your friends. Woohoo! You just made some art. You learned how to do a glaze by adding one layer of watercolor and then adding a second layer of watercolor on top and seeing how those two colors played together. This is awesome. This is one of those foundational techniques that you'll be able to take with you in your watercolor practice. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. We have all kinds of tutorials coming your way. If you're over on Instagram, we would love it if you gave us a follow. I'm at Kate Talcott Artistry. And if you did this tutorial, I'd love if you took a picture and tagged us so that we could cheer you on in your artist's journey. We also have a newsletter anytime we come out with new video tutorials that you can see in the video description below. And there's a link for all of my favorite supplies and a blog post with direct links to all the supplies from this video. Stay tuned for our next week's video where we dig into the wet and wet technique. Happy painting!